Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival. I'm Amy McGuire, and I'm your host for tonight's presentation. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you to please consider supporting these authors by purchasing their books from our wonderful bookseller partner, Politics and Prose. You'll find purchase links in the presentation description. Given all that we've been through over the past year, it's so important to support local and independent stores. I also want to extend a big thank you to our 2021 featured sponsor, the David and Michael Blair Family Foundation, for their generous support. Okay, let's begin. Today's presentation features the short story collections of three accomplished authors of fiction. Land of Big Numbers by Te-Ping Chen traces the journeys of the diverse and Legion Chinese people, their history, their government, and how all of that has tumbled messily, violently, but still beautifully into the present. Te-Ping Chen's fiction has been published in The New Yorker, Granta, Guernica, Tin House, and Bomb. A reporter with the Wall Street Journal, she was previously a correspondent for the paper in Beijing and Hong Kong. Prior to joining the journal in 2012, she spent a year in China as a Fulbright Fellow. A Livewire debut from Dantiel W. Moniz, Milk Blood Heat depicts the sultry lives of Floridians in intergenerational tales that contemplate human connection, race, womanhood, inheritance, and the elemental darkness in us all. Dantiel is the recipient of the Alice Hoffman Prize for Fiction, the Cecilia Joyce Johnson Emerging Writer Award by the Key West Literary Seminar, and a Tin House Scholarship. Milk Blood Heat is an Indie Next Pick, an Amazon Best Book of the Month selection, a Roxane Gay Audacious Book Club pick, as well as the Bellatrist Book Club pick, and has been hailed as a must-read by Time, Entertainment Weekly, BuzzFeed, Elle, and O, the Oprah magazine, among others. The Souvenir Museum by award-winning author Elizabeth McCracken features her most vibrant and heart-rending work to date. With sentences that crackle and spark, Elizabeth traces how our closely held desires bloom and wither against the indifferent passing of time. Elizabeth McCracken is the author of 7 books, including winner of the 2015 Story Prize, Thunderstruck and Other Stories. Her work has been published in the Best American Short Stories, the Pushcart Prize, the O. Henry Prize, the New York Times Magazine, and other places. Elizabeth has been recipient of multiple grants and fellowships, including the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Liguria Study Center, and the American Academy in Berlin. Moderating today's short stories panel is Bethanne Patrick. Bethanne is a writer who tweets at the Book Maven, where she has more than 200,000 followers. One of Flavor Wire's 35 writers who run the literary internet, she enjoys all forms of literary community, online and offline. Bethanne's book reviews and author profiles appear frequently in the Washington Post, where she also writes a monthly column on hot books, the LA Times, NPR Books, and others. The author of 2 books for the National Geographic and the editor of an anthology titled The Books That Changed My Life, she is currently working on a memoir for Counterpoint Press. Welcome to Ping, Dantiel, Elizabeth, and Bethanne.
Thank you, Amy, so much for that wonderful introduction to each of us. I am so thrilled to be here with Elizabeth, Dantiel, and Te-Ping today. And I have to ask, do short stories come from the same place that novels do? Because I think a lot of readers wonder that. And so I am going to throw that first at you, Dantiel.
I'm still kind of struggling to write a novel right now. You know, when I've dreamt of being a writer for a very long time. However, like, you don't get told when you're young, like, oh, short story writer versus novelist. So I just thought, yeah, I'm a writer, I'll be a novelist, but I'm not sure if I am yet a novelist because I have yet to complete a novel. But I think, you know, seeds and inspiration come from the same places, but there's definitely a difference in how what the form requires from a reader. You know what I mean? You know, I think short stories require readers to do a little bit more work, especially if you're having to imagine what the characters' lives are off the page. So I'm not sure. I would throw that next to Elizabeth or Te-Ping.
Elizabeth, I think that is a great throw, and I know you can catch it.
Well, let's see. I totally agree. I think that with Dantiel, I think one's ideas come from very similar places. And I often get asked, like, when do you know something is an idea for a novel or a short story? And I'm not sure I ever do. It's not that I sort of think, oh, this would make a good short story, this would make a good novel. It's much more what I think I'd like to work on at the moment and what I am working on at a moment. Sometimes something feels like an obvious fit, but it's not because of a difference in what the idea is, I think. I think it's just, I feel like with novels and short stories, there's so little that I do on purpose that it is some sort of abstract idea I have at the time.
There is so little that I do on purpose. That's Elizabeth McCracken, ladies and gentlemen. And, you know, and that, it's true. That's what I was going to say. Exactly, Dantiel. It is true. And I think things find their home. They find their shape. Is that what you found, Te-Ping, while you were putting together Land of Big Numbers?
Yeah. I think there's a lightness to short stories. And when you're writing, you can feel like the breeze in some ways, like seeping through and flowing, at least, or maybe that's more me describing the writing process than anything else and necessarily the reading of it. But I feel like short stories, absolutely, you know, you start them and for me, at least, I don't necessarily know where I'm going, but part of why I have found myself so drawn to the form lately is, and not only because of how it can stop time for a moment, you know, and you get to see and visit really intensely with a character at some sort of epic or inflection point in their lives, but also like just the way that you can use short stories to assemble a world, right, and to world build and have different stories and characters refract off of each other. That's something to me that I think is really special about the form, and just you can almost, in some ways, when I was writing Land of Big Numbers, was thinking of them as sort of building blocks. I mean, not part of a novel necessarily, but using them to sort of, you know, create the architecture of a world too.
I love that, and the idea of creating a world. And I also love what you said a few minutes ago, Dantiel, about these characters. You know, you may not know everything about them, but in a short story, you know exactly what you need to know about them. That is something that never ceases to amaze me about well-written short stories and well-crafted collections. So I wanted to ask you each about and it could be quite different. I'm sure it will be quite different, but when you knew you had a collection, because each collection here, and I'll get into that in a couple of minutes, is quite different, not just in terms of the subject and the characters, but also the feelings, the themes, the techniques. So let's see, I'll start with you again, Dantiel. When did you know that Milk, Blood, Heat was a collection? You know, because it doesn't really matter. It doesn't mean a certain number, right? It just is, it is when it is.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And it's something that I feel like I've repeated a lot, but it's absolutely true. So the answer is the same, but it took me a very long time, like 4 or 5 stories before I realized I had a collection. I was writing these stories, and, you know, what I kept coming to was like, you're really boring. You keep writing the same story over and over. You're just changing the names of the characters. And then I had to stop and think about that. And I thought, well, isn't that what collections do? You know what I mean? Don't they take a certain obsession or a question and then put it in these different worlds from the perspective of different people and turn it around at different angles so you can explore it deeper each time with each subsequent meeting of that question? And so it took me a minute to realize it. And once I realized that, I was like, oh, okay, this is a collection then. And so I was able to look at the stories I had already written and kind of see where the echoes and the, like Te-Ping was saying, like the mirroring and the echoes and that kind of stuff, and do that intentionally with the rest of the collection. So yeah, it took a while, but like, I think that's with most creative projects, is that you oftentimes don't know what you're doing until you're like in the middle of it or at the end of it.
Right. No, absolutely. And this is why I think this is such an interesting question, because when a reader approaches a short story collection and really falls into it and thinks, wow, this is wow. Technical terms, by the way. You know that there's something there. And sometimes it's quite deliberate. And sometimes, as you were just saying, Dantiel, it's a little more about the process. So you mentioned Te-Ping, and I'm going to throw it to you next to talk about when you knew you had a collection. And especially because, Te-Ping, you had been in China reporting for the Wall Street Journal. You must have been collecting stories along with your, on the side from journalism. And so when did you start? Was it one story? Was it just a whole bunch of little sketches? How did it go?
Yeah, well, so I mean, I'm coming at this from such an outside perspective, and just so honored to share the stage with like these two amazing writers. I mean, for me, short stories, I'm an admirer, have long been an admirer, and I take what you're saying about, short story collections aren't a number, but in my head it kind of was, because I was looking at books on my shelf saying, well, if I want to try and write short stories, well, this is what they look, and they often seem to come, in certain, sets of 10. So I actually set out really deliberately to myself. I said, I want to try and write short stories. I'm going to try and write 10. I just laid it out that way and started trying to write them when I was, in Beijing with the Wall Street Journal. And I left numbers of stories on the cutting room floor. And in some ways, I mean, thinking about, hearing Dantiel describe her process, I think there is some resonance with the way that, how do you know you have a collection? I mean, it's sort of like the question, there's a character in Land of Big Numbers that she works at a flower shop, and, how do you know you have a bouquet, right? Like you sort of like, it's, I think to an extent, like it was looking at the stories and trying to, pull out the ones, right, that were kind of the centerpiece. And then as it was starting to form, just thinking through, okay, like what are the other notes that I want to hit, and having, like this bright expression here, and, some of the green over there. It's just sounding like an increasingly silly metaphor. But
no, it's not. And I have to interrupt you. And I don't want to do this too often to our readers who may not have approached her at, the individual works that we're talking about today yet. But the great thing is, in that story, in the flower shop, she puts together a bouquet really badly.
Yeah, she wasn't that good at making and I emphasized a lot with that. I also worked in a flower shop and was likewise not.
And I think that's great that because it is so resonant now with what you said. I love the idea of putting together a collection being like the perfect floral arrangement, but sometimes people put together really messy floral arrangements.
Yeah, and sometimes when you try, it's really awkward, and you're trying to figure out how to level out the stems. And for me, I mean, that was definitely part of the process of trying to stand back and look at these stories and think, well, some of these, how do I balance? This looks a little unwieldy, and yeah, I mean, it's all just constant adjusting, I think, and learning. For me.
It is. And Elizabeth, that's the perfect place to bring you in, because I won't say, you are like the doyen of short stories here, but you are the one of the three of you who has written short story collections before. And so when you came to the Souvenir Museum, did you have some things that you already knew about yourself and your process that helped you put it together?
I'm not sure, because I do think first of all, I should say, I don't think necessarily writers get better the more books that they write. Mm-hmm. And that I think also that most of the writers I know who are a few books in, we're always looking to try to return to the state that we were in when we were writing our first books, because it is a moment when you are full of the right kind of ambition, and it's you and the work in this particular way. And that's what I'm always trying to do. So maybe a fancy way of saying, if I've learned anything about myself in short stories, I try to forget it. Because I do have, like Dantiel, I do sometimes look at my work and going, am I just writing the same short story over and over again? And I think it's okay and sensible in a single collection to go, oh, I'm like a painter or a poet, and this is the period I'm in right now.
Yes.
I have to admit, I do not want to be writing the same short story now that I wrote in 1993. Like that seems awful to me to have not changed. And I think in my case, just putting together the collection, it's similar. I had 4 or 5. The terrifying thing that happened to me with this book is that I had a contract to write it, and my lovely editor wrote to me and said, "Are you almost done with it?" And I went, "Oh, I guess I should be paying attention to the deadlines." And I thought I had 6 stories, and I thought that was most of a collection. But somewhere along the lines, I started writing shorter short stories. So I put them all together, and I had 88 pages.
Oh no! Oh no!
So a certain amount of the book was written out of terror and and fear. If there are,
it's there are 2 questions I want to ask that I was planning on talking about later, but because you talked about terror, I have to bring up the fact, and this is something that always amazes me. It doesn't surprise me. It amazes me in approaching short story collections, especially the ones I love, as I did the 3 of yours, that there are still stories that shock. And we all know about, the classics of shock, right? The yellow wallpaper, the lottery, the cask of Amontillado. But in each of your collections here, there's probably more than one shocking story, but for me, in each book, there was one story that particularly stood out for me and just made me sort of clench all of my abs, and I don't want to spoil anything for anyone else, but I do want to talk about what it's like to come to a moment when you're going to shock the reader with something. It could be with an emotion. It could be with an act that is just barbaric. That's Dantiel probably knows what I'm talking about. It could be with just a fact of life that is so sad and hard. So what is it like to create a story like that is going to have a gut punch for someone reading it? Is that a fair question? And I guess I should, Elizabeth, I'll start with you because, and do you, if you want me to tell you the one for your book, it was Bird Song from the Radio. That was a total gut punch. I think I mentioned that on Twitter yesterday.
Yeah. I'm going to repeat myself and say it really is remarkable how little I do on purpose or plan. And I am very casual about killing characters. That's for short stories and novels. And I think I do sometimes finish a story and know, among other things, that it's not for everybody, but that it seems, and I think that's actually, I could never write anything if I thought I was writing things for everybody.
Very good point.
Some of my stories, I know, people are not going to like that or find it too sad or too dark. And in the case of that story, I was actually commissioned to write that story by Kate Bernheimer for a collection of retellings of myths called Exo Orpheus, and it's based on a myth about a mother and children. And that probably gave me permission to go darker and more mythical and more, yes, people have to die and be eaten in this story, because that is what the form is asking for me.
No spoilers here. Actually, the eating is actually bread, but it still was a very shocking moment for me. And Dantiel, of course, I think I'm getting it right. Is it Feast? Is that the title of the story that I'm thinking of?
I don't know. It could be that, or it could be Exotics. I'm not sure.
It's Exotics.
Is it the Supper Club? Yeah.
Yes, with the Supper Club. That is a story that has antecedents. And I'm not going to mention them because those would be spoilers. And it may not have had those antecedents for you, but it is a story that truly, packs a punch and is a little bit shorter than some of the other stories in the collection. So how about you? Was that something that, just rose up and, leapt onto the page, or was it something you had to think about really hard?
I will say that there were a lot of moments in the collection that, I was writing a particular scene, or I knew there was a scene I was heading to, and I was like, can I write this? Like, will I be canceled off of the earth if I put this on paper? And, when it came to that question, I had to be like, well, I mean, if it's in my mind, if it's come to me, then I feel like I have to write it down and explore it. And if I'm thinking about it or wondering it, I'm not the only person. That's the thing that I love about fiction and storytelling, is that, like, you're not alone in this. This is a whole human experience, which includes lightness and darkness, which is what I was which was most important for me to get down on the page. It's not just the sunshine, it's also the rain. Do you know what I mean? And so I think for that story in particular, there's been a lot of comments about that story where people are like, it doesn't feel like it fits. It feels like it's a departure from everything else that I'm doing in the book. But it's actually the fact that I am dealing so literally with everything else that I'm doing in the book when I'm talking about the systems that we live in, such as white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy and class and, race and all of those things. I'm dealing with it so literally that it seems surreal to other people, like when you read it, versus the other stories where it's kind of couched in the, the everyday lives of these characters. So I feel like, yeah, I've had plenty of moments where I was like, I don't know, people are gonna be like, this is so dark. But again, I'm not writing for everybody.
No, and none of you is writing for everybody, and we wouldn't want you to. And in the case of that story, what is very interesting to me, Dantiel, in what you just said, is you're exactly right. You're talking, here you have these people who are working as caterers for some very rich clients who like to eat exotic, game, and it works for me as part of it, because that is what you're exploring. You're exploring the fact that when you're working for someone, you don't have the ability to comment directly on what they're doing.
Yeah, so telling paycheck. Yeah.
Yes,
I mean,
because you're
as a server. That's, before I was taking my writing seriously and went to grad school and all that, I was only a server or a bartender. And I have to, even just having to say only a server or bartender tells you a lot about what people feel about jobs that keep people alive. Do you know what I mean? As far as like classism and all of that stuff. But yeah.
No, that is so true. And Te-Ping, I have to, therefore, this is maybe, I think, your title story is very hard and shocking for me as a reader. But in terms of what Dantiel has just been talking about, I have to, and I'm going to, you'll know that the Cow, the story, what is the title?
Flying Machine. Yeah.
Flying Machine is a story that is so much about class and about who gets to do what in a community and who is given, an amount of respect and who isn't. And so even though I was talking specifically about stories that have a real shock to them, I think that Flying Machine is a great one to talk about with what Dantiel just said. Seeing things in short stories that you can't even get in a novel. A novel can't encompass all of that place and all of Cow's work and life and relationships. And then somehow in a short story, it's like a demi-glace. It's so concentrated. Does that resonate with you? And does that, especially around that story?
Yeah. Well, and I was just, as I was listening to Elizabeth and Dantiel reflect, like I was trying to think of what would be shocking for readers coming to a collection about China, because I think it's just a place where already people have such defined and strongly colored images. Like, I think there's no level of state violence that you could depict that would shock people. Like, I don't think there's just so much, I think, already that readers carry in their minds approaching the story and the context in some ways. So like a story like Flying Machine, I'm glad that you mentioned it, because I think in some ways, like when I was trying to think like well, what would be shocking, in some ways it's like stories like that one, right? That when you're trying to present a part of life that is, I think, in the case of that story, it's, there's lightness to it, right? There's noodle chopping robots, there's funeral strippers, there's this, rural inventor making this airplane. And I think maybe for some readers, the shock is just actually the lightness in the collection too, in moments like that, right? And as you see the demi-glace and all of that, like I think those sorts of kind of the counterbeats in the book, some of those are really the ones that I think are more surprising.
They are. The noodle chopping robot is just, what I love about the noodle chopping robot is you can imagine a middle-aged man anywhere in the world coming up with something like that. And it just happens to be for chopping noodles because he's in this Chinese town. But, in another place, it might be for slicing ham, or it might be for chopping up, tomatoes, or whatever it happens to be. I love the universality in the idea of men and gadgets. That just
absolutely.
And that is something definitely, Elizabeth, to turn here. There's so many things I want to ask each one of you, but universality is something that came up for me in the stories in the Souvenir Museum that feature Sadie and Jack, because they are a couple who we see at different ages. We see different glimpses of their lives together. They're clearly very much in love. They're also, he's sort of English, sort of American. She's a little Jewish here, a little secular there. They're a real mix. And yet they stand for so many loving, committed couples, whether they're married or not, whether they're cishet or not. They're just what readers can say, oh, here's a relationship, I have a relationship, and they put themselves into Jack and Sadie, I think. Or maybe it's just me, but would you comment on that?
Oh, on them appealing to a lot of different people?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I feel both as a reader and as a writer is the only way to be universal is to be very specific about the people that you're writing about, and that's the goal. I was talking on doing a Q&A with Susan Stinson, who's a friend of mine, also one of my favorite writers, and she was talking about her novel Martha Moody, which she wrote a few decades ago, and it's a sort of alternate Western and really beautiful. And she said that she had written it as a love song to the fat lesbian writers with whom she was in a writing group, and very specifically, like that was her concern. And I think that that's one of the things that makes that book so meaningful to a lot of people, because love songs, if you write with that sort of intent, love songs are written very specifically, but they mean a lot to a lot of people. So that's the only way I know how to make resonant work. And also when I read work, is what it's that precision. I think my favorite living short story writer is Edward P. Jones, who writes about very specific people in a very specific place. And they are so about the human condition because of the unbelievable specificity. For me, that's always what radiates out. And I hope to try to do a little of that when I'm writing.
We have now decided to turn the rest of this panel into an I Stan Edward P. Jones because people, I love that, we're mentioning some other writers. So definitely check out Martha Moody by Susan Stinson and The Known World by Edward P. Jones. And, let's just keep a reading list going. But let's also talk about something I found in all three books, because all three books could not be more different, could not be about more different places and people, but gatherings and celebrations are central to many of the stories in all three of your books. And so you could be very specific about one type of story, or you could talk to me about sort of the meta meaning. Te-Ping, let me start with you about those kinds of things, parties and dinners and things that people share.
Yeah. I think for me, the way that they surfaced in the book was just, when you're trying to think through, like, the settings for, you know, where human life takes place, right? Like, for me, certain moments like a wedding, right? As you see in one book, like you're just looking for the places that are inherently already sort of like showcases of human drama, and then layering another drama on top of that.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think for me, just trying to find those moments where you see not just like those, you know, through a gathering like a wedding, right? You can see the wider lens of society, and you learn a lot about the place. Like already, you just immediately bring a reader into the world that way. And then behind, you know, behind all that, in front of all that backdrop, you get to see, you know, a drama playing right in front of that other, you know, sort of larger human drama. And I love that about, just as like a fixture of a scene, the way that some moments like gathering and celebration that you're talking about just already inherently set the stage.
You know, I'm going to interject a little anecdote here. My current obsession with my YouTube stream is watching videos of Hasidic weddings. And who knows how or when they started, but talk about little stories in and of themselves, because they're very formulaic, these videos. Clearly, you know, they all use the same videographer. Clearly, there are certain things that are important to the celebration, but within that structure, you see these particularities: the shade of lipstick the bride chooses, a different kind of hat that the groom wears, something in the faces of the mother and the mother-in-law while they're walking, you know, the couple down the aisle. It is just, it's like a little slice of a short story, a scene from a short story. I just crave that. And as Elizabeth was saying a few minutes ago, I crave what gatherings and celebrations can tell us about so many people in a community. And you have a story, Dantiel, about a moon party, a moon gathering that was really fantastic in that way. I loved it when, in particular, when you get to what the women who have gathered for this party, all the food, the big fat beautiful grapes and the oozy cheeses and all these delicious things. And you know, that's what we want when we gather together. We want to break bread together. We want to have something, whatever our version of delicious grapes and cheese is. And there's no way a reader cannot be drawn to that, reminded of all the connotations in her own life for that. It's something I think that does permeate all of Milk, Blood, Heat, is details that are tied to different neighborhoods in Jacksonville, but also live for all of us in other places. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, I was thinking of, that's the first scene that came into my mind too, is the Moon Festival that's in an Almanac of Bones, and it's all of these women gathering together. And really, you know, there's all this sensory details, you know, feel, touch, sight, taste, the whole shebang. But I'm thinking it's all about connection in the end, and how people are being able to drop whatever their barriers are, or whatever they think their role and whatever their lives are, and just be together. But it also made me, while everyone was talking, was thinking about the places where we gather, where the relationships are a bit more transactional. There's still that seeking of connection. Like there's a lot of bars and, you know, relationships between bartenders and their clients and things like that that's happening. And that's also
Elizabeth, we're going there. Sorry.
Sorry. There's also a space in which people are gathering or seeking connection, and it's changed. It's a little bit muddy, right, by that capitalist aspect, but that's still this seeking that I'm trying to explore.
Thank you. And again, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but when you started talking about bars, I'm like, oh, Elizabeth, in the Souvenir Museum, there are a couple of experiences in bars that are just, and some of them are contemporary, but some of them are sort of the bars that we don't see anymore in the Northeast. You know, if you'll forgive me, I definitely felt a wonderful shiver of Stuart Onan when you were describing these bars, and I thought, wow, these really were places that were so important for people to gather in. And it's not easy to describe something like that and get it right, especially something that may
I
be...
did a lot of research in my by drinking in those bars.
You know, you did such a great job, but it is definitely the idea that a place like a bar, and all of you have places like this, whether they're night markets, Te-Ping or Dantiel, you have bars, of course, and Elizabeth as well, where people really do feel at home. And it's not home, and maybe it shouldn't be home, but it is nonetheless. And I thought, is the bar a perfect vehicle for a short story to happen in? That might be a little whimsical. So if no one wants to answer it, it's okay. But what do you think, Elizabeth?
I don't know, maybe. I mean, it's also interesting thinking about them, as Dantiel mentions, as transactional experiences, and that in any bar, there are the regulars, there are the people who stumble in through the door, and there are the people who are standing on their feet for hours every day behind the bar.
Right.
And all of those things are necessary to what make them interesting, transactional, and dramatic places. And I think it probably, I mean, it must be. I'm thinking of the William Saroyan play, the Time of Our Lives, set entirely in a bar. They are inherently dramatic because there's a cast of characters, and that some people might be behaving unpredictably, which is always good for fiction, unpredictable behavior. And also because there really is a different reason that everybody is brought to that place. I think that's true. Thinking about Te-Ping talking about the drama of weddings too, that it is, everybody ostensibly is brought to a wedding for the same reason, but also for widely different reasons. And that's also inherently dramatic and interesting. And there are people who behave unpredictably at weddings. I think maybe it's that combination of the predictable and the unpredictable that makes them interesting.
And I think too, like off what you were saying before, Elizabeth, like we've all been in bars, we've all been to weddings, and every time we go to a bar or wedding, like, you know, we're seeing all the times, you know, that we'd sat in one before, right? Or like we thinking about our own wedding or a family member's wedding or loved one. And just like, that's what I think makes what you were saying so resonant about just like finding the universal and the very, very particular. These are all familiar stage sets that we've occupied, right? And we take something different away and seeing people occupy them in different moments in their lives.
Well, go ahead, Dantiel.
I was just gonna say, back to your question, I don't know if, like, you know, the bar is like the perfect place to set a story, but it's definitely the perfect place to find a story in terms of like, I was a server and a bartender for a long time, and I'm just like, it's a crazy what people will tell you when they don't see you as fully human when you're in this kind of servient role. But just, so I'll say that I've got.
I love that. And, you know, this brings me to something that I did want to talk about, because another piece that I found really expert in all of your collections, and I'm just so grateful that the Gaithersburg Book Festival people realize the excellence here, is each of you in different ways and in different stories collapses time in ways that can be really important to the story. And that is not easy to do. So I was wondering if you could each take a moment and talk about, you know, a point where you realize, oh, I'm going to have to get rid of some decades in order to finish this story. How do I do it? Te-Ping, does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I think in some ways with short stories, I find I'm someone who just gets obsessed with little details and wanting, you know, like have been hoarding sort of little morsels and tidbits and wanting to find places to weave them into stories, like all through my time as a reporter in Beijing. That's sort of what I felt like I was doing. And so in some ways, just as someone whose sense of fiction, I think, does tend to hinge on like a particular moment in time or a detail, for me, when I think about time, it was much more figuring out how to expand outwards and add on decades, right? Instead of subtract. And I think the times that I found myself doing that most a little bit was just in thinking about, wanting to convey, in some cases, you're trying to write about a very particular moment and a very particular person. But in some short stories, and I think short stories are particularly well suited to this, when you're making in some, sometimes a more allegorical or political point too, you want to think about how events arc over a character's life, a family's life, right? And sort of, I think adding on that time in some ways allows the reader to see more of that sort of essential aspect to a story. Like it's not, it's not just this one moment in time, but it's expanding outwards through your character's life, expanding out through his family's life, and hopefully also to yours too. I think that's the way that I thought about time, at least. And when I was expanding it outwards and trying to give those stories sometimes that additional weight and perspective.
Really interesting, expanding outwards instead of I guess I'm just a reductionist at heart. Dantiel, how about for you when you were approaching these kinds of expansions or contractions of time?
Yeah, so first I'll say I'm the same as Te-Ping. I call them seeds, but I collect a bunch of different seeds, whether that's an image or an idea or whatever, and I put them in, I write them down in my phone, and then my brain is doing the work of like, okay, these two go together, and now we're going to put them in a folder so we can make them into a story, whatever. But I would say that actually I feel like I have a really hard time with time. Like, I don't think that I'm particularly good at it, but there are a couple of moments when I knew, like, for example, if it was a child narrator, as in Outside the Raft, I wanted to be able to be on the level of the child, but also have that moment where the adult reflection is layered on top of it, so that you're getting both of these perspectives about the same moment, and like, how does that change your experience of that moment, or the character's experience of that moment. So I'm not sure I'm really good at time. I'm working on getting better at it with the novel, but again, it's a we'll see type of process. Like, I don't know yet.
Well, I think you're really great at it. How about you, Elizabeth, and time? Especially, again, I'm sorry to keep going back to Sadie and Jack because I just love them. You're working in different points of their lives and different points of their family members' lives. And we, of course, the first story, when they go to the wedding in England, what is the title of that?
It's The Irish Wedding.
The Irish Wedding. Thank you. So I'm thinking about that because there's so many different people whose lives and chronologies need to intersect. And that's another way of working with time in a short story.
I mean, I guess it goes without saying that I didn't do it necessarily on purpose, but with a real plan. Except for when I read work, I like to read work that is strange about time, that isn't necessary, especially in short stories where it feels like it's almost a superpower you can exploit in a short story.
Yes.
To slow down or speed up, and still create a whole world that you can hold in your head and a reader can experience in one sitting and experience time in that particular way. I guess I kind of feel like all novels have as a topic, or most of them do, time and the passage of time. And they're beholden to the fact that it takes you a long time to read them, that your
yes,
reader has a relationship with your work in time in a different way than they do in a short story. And I feel like that gives you freedom, if you want to take it in a short story, to do strange and interesting things and flash forward and flashback. I know some people don't like flashbacks. I love them.
I like them too.
I do too. I agree with you about flashbacks. And and of course, I'm sorry, it's because I'm trying not to look down while we're having the panel. The other short story I'm thinking about is the one in which David and his father, Louis, are on a trip to Scotland. And they're in the Hebrides, correct? Where are they?
I think they're in the Inner Hebrides, except for, I believe that they're the Inner Hebrides.
The Inner Hebrides. And we know that the father has some level of dementia, but we don't know how much. And so one of the things that occurred to me in thinking about that story was the weight of how a person's life has happened, all of this chronology and trajectory, and then they're left as a man who is sort of getting lost looking for birds on this inner Hebridean island. And you just have to imagine him from his sweet interactions, and he loves the puffins that he sees. And you are able to extrapolate from that, oh, here is a man who must be a little bit sweet, but maybe he wasn't. And so the uncertainty in the time also is something that fascinates me in the stories, that, you're not, anytime there's a short story, you're not getting the full story. And so, as you said, Elizabeth, you can play with that. And it's really malleable and plastic and amazing. And I realized that I'm talking about all of these particular stories, and I want to give each of you a little bit of time to talk about a couple of larger topics. But one thing about process, I asked how you know when you have a collection. How do you know when a story itself is finished? This is something that, as a reader and as a critic, will never stop fascinating me, because short story endings can be not, we already talked about things that are shocking. Yeah, we know that. But they can be so surprising and so open-ended and not at all what you expected. And sometimes that's wonderful. Sometimes it's absolutely so irritating. But how do you, as the writer, know when a story is finished? Dantiel, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so in my process, this has been mostly true. Is that I usually know where I want to end a story. That's usually the first thing that comes to me. And so, and sometimes it's an ending and a beginning, and sometimes it's just an ending. So I'm basically working my way to that ending. And so for me, it's all about, I feel a story is done when I have earned that ending, whatever that ending is. And that's what it is for me.
Wow, that's really powerful. And of course, that doesn't mean getting to that ending is easy.
No, not at all. Just I have like an idea or an image where I'm like, okay, that's the last line. And very rarely I've maybe had to tweak what I thought the last line was, but like that general atmosphere, that mood is usually what stays consistent.
That, again, not easy, but very powerful. How about you, Te-Ping?
I think in some ways, I tend to play around with endings a lot. And so sometimes when writing, I'll have 6 different endings. And it's like, pick a path, and then just sort of walking the emotional path with the characters, and then feeling how it feels to stand in that place. And I think for me, the emotions that I'm looking for are surprise and a sense of maybe like second beat awareness, either for the reader or the character, of what's transpired beforehand. And I think too, like before, I was mentioning how like I think of short stories sometimes as a medium that's like shot through with light and air. And I think in the writing of endings in particular, I'm mindful of wanting to open up that space even further and feel sort of possibility coming through, pulling back the camera. And then hopefully, in some cases, it's like, I think of it a little bit as wanting to leave a reader like looking out across of, an open horizon or a plane. Just, they've spent a lot of time intensely engaging with characters in like often very particular moments in their lives. And at the end, you want to sort of pull back the curtain and let them stand and just see the, what it signifies, like the importance.
Wow, that's quite beautiful. And it also is exactly, I think, what really good short stories do, like you said, pulling back that curtain, and you see, oh yes, here I am in this world, and I live in the world that these characters live in. And of course, that doesn't mean that the story is based on real life or has, I know in the 3 collections we're talking about here, we're mostly talking about people who live in the contemporary world, but I think it has the same effect if you're reading something that's, fantasy or dystopia, or, it just is that moment that's a great way of putting it. Thank you. And Elizabeth, how about you? Because you are one of the writers whose short story endings often most surprise me. They don't infuriate me at all, but they surprise me. And I think, I didn't know we were going there. I didn't know we were going to that moment. And I wish I could explain that better, but I think, do you understand what I mean?
I think so. I mean, and I feel like my answer is similar to both Dantiel and Te-Ping, that I frequently have the end of the story in mind when I start something, and the beginning sometimes changes, the end generally doesn't, and sort of that sense of momentum and finishing something comes from getting from the start to the end. But some of the sort of the shifts at the end of my stories happening as I get to the end of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that readers of short stories their brains are most malleable and willing to go with you to strange places at the very end of a story, to stand and look back at the end of the story as the author pulls back the curtain. And I mean, maybe this is true for everything I write. I tend to write the kind of endings that I'm a sucker for when I read them in other people's work. And I love it when stories get strange at the end, when there's a sudden surprise of either character action or point of view or form or anything like that.
Again, that is something that always strikes me in your stories, and I look forward to it because it is not something that I can anticipate, and yet it always brings that. And we're talking about finishing stories, and you want something. It doesn't have to leave you with I can't remember the term in music I'm looking for with a chord that offers resolution. Because sometimes when you pull that curtain, something really disturbing is there, or something that leads you elsewhere. So it's not about satisfaction. It's not about resolution. It's not about contentment. It's about knowing, oh, I arrived somewhere, one of my favorite sayings is, it's the journey, not the arrival, that matters. But in short stories, that arrival is really important. It really is. I guess sticking the landing is the way it is. And I don't know how any of you do it, because I feel like any short stories I ever work on, I'm like, oh no, but that's another panel for another time. So with our very short amount of time left in the panel, there are a few things I want to give you each a chance to talk about the overarching either place or theme. You can choose. Dantiel, for instance, could you talk about Jacksonville and the fact that you are of Jacksonville, but that this makes a collection of short stories about people who are also different? So just a little bit about the city.
Yeah. So I think the last time I had seen my city written about in a book was the Twilight series. And that was like the first time that I had thought like, oh, people know we exist. People know this is a city. But for me, it was just important for me to write about the place that I'm from, that, stories happen here. People are worthy of stories here. Like, you grow up outside of the like literary cities. It's like, oh no, you have to be in New York or you have to be in wherever to go write a story.
Right.
Those are the only stories worth paying attention to. And that's absolutely not true. And so I wanted to, contribute to the literary canon of my home state and my city non-stereotypically. That's basically where all that came from.
I love that. I just reviewed a book that is set in Milwaukee. And let me tell you, there is not a big canon of literature about Milwaukee. There's American Gods and a couple of others. So every place is worthy of being covered. And Elizabeth, you have a lot of different places that you're writing about in the Souvenir Museum, but the two places you light down upon frequently, which are the Boston area and the Austin area, do come in. And so you are using places that are meaningful to you, but also that you inhabit.
Yes. And it took me a while. I've now been in the Austin area for 11 years. And I finally wrote a story that took place in Austin after maybe 6 years, and largely because I was irritated by grackles.
The grackle story. I love it. Yes.
And I am always, I'm interested in, again, as a reader, I like to read about place. We could go back to Edward P. Jones, and Washington. I love that it makes a difference where fiction occurs, whether it's an actual place or an imaginary place. So I love to know what the street signs look like and what things smell like. And I probably write about Boston in a way that I didn't used to, because I have not lived there now for 11 years, and I miss it. I miss people in Austin are friendly, and I don't understand that. Go back to Boston, and there's a certain kind of meanness that is very comforting to me. Strange old ladies yelling at me in
I love
They're
that.
not armed. The strange old ladies who yell at you in grocery stores in Boston are by and large not armed. I miss that.
They're by and large not armed. That's right. But we do miss those particularities. And Te-Ping, obviously, you. How long did you live in China?
Off and on. Oh, I don't even know, to add it up. Maybe the most recent stint was about 6 years.
Right. Okay. So, and now you are not there. In writing about the land of big numbers, if you will, did you have to rely on certain kinds of memories, even if you had notes after, notebook after notebook after notebook? Were there things that you found you wanted to and needed to recall and had to do from your head, from your psyche?
Yeah, well, when writing the book, I mean, I was lucky that most of it, some of the edits occurred when I was stateside, but really I was writing it when I was in Beijing. And so it was just like a continuous stream of like being out, reporting, traveling, doing interviews, and it might be a detail like a photo on someone's coffee table, or some side anecdote they might have told me that would seep its way into the fiction. And it was all like a really continuous stream I found of inhabiting the place and writing the place and thinking about it and just feeling like that it was just, like living really three-dimensionally in not just the journalism, but of course the fiction. And that feels, I feel really lucky that I was able to write the book when I was actually in the country, because of course, so recently, a lot of journalists have been kicked out of the country, including my colleagues. So when I think about place and I think about how that informed the book, like, of course, so much of what's in the book is, like the really arresting visual sensory details of life in modern China, which I think, again, talk of places that are unmapped. Like I felt like I just really hadn't, I wrote this book really in a lot of ways because I hadn't read anything in a fictional context that presented the country both like those, the sort of starker, smoggier, bleaker landscapes, political landscapes too, that we are familiar with, but also just like, sort of the richer colors, like the more human strands too of that story. And so I think the writing and the sense of place found its way to the pages in that sense, but also too, I think gave it that feeling of urgency, right? Like knowing that these stories, plural, were happening around me, and like, if not grasped, could just go in some ways, at least for me, unrecorded. And I think a lot of what is magical about fiction is its ability to stop time and preserve it. And I think in writing, like that's what gave this project life and urgency, was just this feeling of needing to do that for this very particular place.
Which is something in, again, all three of these books that I see and that leaps off the page, and is so, there's such a generosity in the writing that I see from all three of you. And that is not nothing. So thank you. Thank you for these collections. Is it fair if I ask each of you to say just a little bit about what you are working on now or what we might see next? Yeah, no one wants to take that, right? Now, Dantiel, you already let us know you're working on a novel. So yeah. I'll if you want to talk about it, okay, but if you want me to let you off the hook, I will.
Yeah, I'm in the superstitious stage of it where I don't want to let the magic of it leak out. I'm still trying to figure out what it is. So I am working on a novel, and I know like so many people would be happy because it's like, I wish this was a novel. I wish this was a novel. It's like, okay, well, the short stories are not a novel, but I have one. So please chill.
It will happen. It will happen. Te-Ping, how about you?
Same, highly superstitious. I don't think anyone really read much of anything until like literally like the book was done, like signed, sealed, delivered, like about to be birthed into this world. And at that point, it's like, okay, you're my friend. Like, can you just like read this quickly, make sure I haven't like, don't have any glaring grammatical errors. But I tend to be really fearful that if you talk too much about something, you'll ruin it. So I'm gonna, I'll lifeline and Elizabeth, would you like?
I'm going to read to you from my 500-page novel now because I'm not. I do feel like I'm superstitious too. I've got 2 books that I'm sort of working on. Both of them are very little. Like I'm willing to tell you about like technical aspects of them.
Sure.
They're quite short. They're one of them is more autobiographical than the other, but there is something about that. I think it's related to that thing that I said earlier about we all want to go back to how we were working on our first books, because you need an intense relation, or at least I am always, anytime a writer ever says this is what you need to do to write, all they mean is this is how I write, and I would like to be validated in my own process.
100%.
Yeah. So similarly, I feel like I need that privacy with my work early on.
Yeah.
I think that is fair. That is really, go ahead, Dantiel.
No, I was just going to add to that. So when I teach my students, I do believe that, when people say writing is a solitary practice, that's true up until a point for me, you know what I mean? Afterwards, it becomes such a community of love and like dedication. So many people go into making a book, but I do think it's so important to protect what is solitary about the work when it's still in those beginning stages so that a community can be beneficial to it. I think getting other people with their eyes on it or their opinions on it can be detrimental to the work when it's still figuring out what it is.
I think that is so true. And it's also a great way for us to tie this up, and I can let you all get back to writing. And I hope we are going to be able to meet again. So until soon.
I'd like to thank you for joining us today for this presentation. We have an amazing lineup of author presentations taking place right here throughout the month of May. You don't want to miss them. Go to Gaithersburgbookfestival.org and look over the schedule so you can plan the rest of your festival month. And now here is an important message from renowned author and independent bookstore owner, Ann Patchett, and her dog, Sparky. Enjoy, everyone.
I'm Ann Patchett here at Parnassus Books with my dog Sparky, and I want to tell you the importance of supporting your local independent bookstore, Politics and Prose. They are a remarkable partner with this book festival. Now, when a book festival is live, it's really easy. You just go to the table and you buy your book and then you go to the event. But when a book festival is virtual, it gets a little trickier because you're home and you might think, well, I'll just buy the book on Amazon. So I'm here to tell you, don't buy the book on Amazon. For one thing, Jeff Bezos has enough money, right? He's trying to colonize the moon or something. He doesn't need anything that you've got. Politics and Prose, on the other hand, they're your local independent bookstore, and you love them, and they bring you so many events. They work harder than any bookstore I know in their community. And if you want them to be there alive and healthy and well when all this is over, you actually need to support them. They are the people that are putting a tax base in your community, okay? So you have teachers and police officers and firefighters, and when you pay a couple dollars more for a book, you're creating jobs in your community. So enjoy your book festival, support Politics and Prose. Remember, Ann Patchett and Sparky think it's the thing to do. Shop local. Thank you.